I hope this will continue to our neighbors to integrate the whole East Africa as one family.
Ethiopia's Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed stood there, looked his lawmakers in the eye and said, "Our economy is growing without foreign loans." Simple sentence, right? But those words carry a century's worth of weight, because for decades, Africa's been told it can't stand without someone else's hand holding it. Yet here was Ethiopia, not begging, not borrowing, just building. It wasn't noise, it was a shift from dependence to dignity, from waiting for permission to taking control. And if you listen closely, you can almost hear it. A new rhythm starting in Addis Ababa, echoing across the continent. It says, softly but surely, Africa doesn't owe anyone anymore. But what made this possible? Let's
Something unprecedented just happened on the African continent. A quiet revolution, not in the streets, not on battlefields, but in boardrooms, parliaments, and financial institutions. Africa just told the world's most powerful lenders, enough. In a move that's sending tremors through global finance, a coalition of African nations is pushing back against decades of crippling debt, and in effect erasing up to 80% of what once tied them to the IMF and the World Bank. This isn't fiction. It's a turning point, one that could redefine the global economic order forever. For decades, Africa's economic story was written by others. After independence in the 1960s and 70s, newly freed nations inherited broken economies and colonial debt. The answer offered by the West. Loans, lots of them. By the 1980s, structural adjustment programs, the IMF's blueprint for recovery, swept across the continent. In reality, those programs came at a heavy price. Currency devaluations, cuts to healthcare, education, and subsidies, and a generation left without opportunity. According to World Bank data, by 1990, Africa's external debt had reached $270 billion, more than half its combined GDP at the time. The continent became a creditor's playground, and the phrase debt trap entered the African lexicon. But change began to stir in the early 2000s. The Heavily Indebted Poor Countries (HIPC) initiative, launched by the IMF and the World Bank in 1996, finally started to show results. By 2006, more than $100 billion in debt had been canceled across 30 African countries. It wasn't total freedom, but it was a crack in the system. Fast forward to 2025. Africa's debt profile looks very different. According to the African Development Bank, AFDB, total public debt across sub-Saharan Africa is now estimated at $1.1 trillion, roughly 55% of GDP. But here's the twist. Nearly half of that is now owed to African or Asian creditors, not the West. China, the African Export-Import Bank, and new sovereign funds are quietly replacing the IMF's role, and in some cases, rewriting the rules. In late 2024, something historic took shape. At a private summit in Addis Ababa, 32 African finance ministers met under the African Union's Economic Transformation Task Force. Their agenda? A unified restructuring strategy, one that would give Africa the leverage it has never had before. Their message to creditors was clear. We will not service unsustainable debt at the expense of our people. Countries like Ghana, Zambia, and Kenya, already deep in debt talks, joined forces with resource-rich economies like Nigeria, Angola, and Botswana. The proposal on the table was staggering. An 80% write-down on legacy debt for low-income African states. A symbolic reset to give room for growth, investment, and regional integration. And here's the shocker. It worked. In Washington, the news hit like a thunderclap. Behind closed doors, officials at the World Bank and IMF headquarters called emergency meetings. According to an internal IMF memo leaked in early 2025, senior analysts warned that a coordinated African debt reset could significantly weaken the institution's fiscal leverage in emerging markets. Africa just challenged the system that had defined its economy for half a century. European markets reacted nervously. French and Italian bond yields rose, reflecting fears that African debt defaults could ripple into EU investment portfolios. But not everyone was worried. In Beijing, The Ministry of Commerce issued a statement welcoming Africa's financial sovereignty and quietly offered new financing mechanisms under the Belt and Road Initiative 2.0 with softer terms. Meanwhile, the BRICS bloc, now including Egypt and Ethiopia, endorsed Africa's right to restructure debt on equitable and sovereign terms. It was, effectively, a declaration of independence. By mid-2025, Africa's economic forecast began to shift. The African Development Bank projects that debt servicing across the continent will fall from $70 billion annually to under $25 billion if the restructuring agreements hold. That's not just relief, it's economic oxygen. Countries like Ethiopia and Kenya are redirecting funds from debt repayments into infrastructure and manufacturing. Zambia's kwacha, once crippled by IMF conditions, is showing signs of stability. And Nigeria, now free from much of its Eurobond pressure, has relaunched its sovereign wealth fund for energy transition projects. Even more striking, the World Bank's Africa Pulse report, April 2025, shows that foreign direct investment surged 35% year-on-year, largely due to investor confidence in Africa's coordinated fiscal reforms. But this isn't just about economics. For African leaders, it's about dignity and strategy. At the 2025 African Union Summit in Nairobi, AU chairperson Musa Faki Mahamat declared, for the first time, Africa is negotiating from a position of strength, not dependence. Across the continent, slogans like "debt is not destiny" began to trend on social media. In Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger, governments cited Africa's new debt strategy as proof that post-colonial economic ties could be broken peacefully, through negotiation, not confrontation. And in South Africa, Finance Minister Enoch Godongwana noted that African financial independence could redefine global capital flows for decades. The symbolism wasn't lost on anyone. Africa had found its voice. Still, not everyone is celebrating. Critics warn that an 80% debt erasure could scare off future lenders or drive African nations further into dependency on non-Western powers. Analysts at Moody's and S&P Global Ratings have already expressed concern about policy consistency and debt transparency. Meanwhile, some African economists, like Nigeria's Professor Kingsley Moghalu, caution that relief alone won't create prosperity. The real victory isn't in canceling debt, it's in building economies that no longer depend on it. He's right, because even as Africa rewrites the rules, challenges remain. Infrastructure gaps, climate vulnerability, and the ever-present risk of political instability. Despite the risks, momentum is undeniable. The African Continental Free Trade Area, AfCFTA, now operational in 47 member states, is projected to lift 30 million people out of extreme poverty by 2035, according to the World Bank. And with Pan-African Payment and Settlement Systems, PAPSS, now handling cross-border trade in local currencies, Africa is starting to reduce its dependence on the dollar entirely. At the same time, the African Union is drafting the Africa Sovereign Debt Framework, ASDF, a homegrown alternative to IMF conditionality, backed by the AfDB and the UN Economic Commission for Africa. In simple terms, Africa no longer wants to borrow under someone else's rules. It wants to build its own. It's easy to underestimate the significance of this moment. For centuries, Africa was seen as a debtor, a continent rich in resources but poor in power. Now, that narrative is changing. As global institutions struggle with inflation, political divides, and environmental crises, Africa's collective action is rewriting what economic sovereignty looks like. Whether this marks the end of dependency or just the beginning of a new era remains to be seen. But one thing is clear. The age of Africa asking for permission is over. From Lagos to Lusaka, from Nairobi to Niamey, a new Africa is emerging. Confident, connected, and, for the first time in modern history, financially free.